Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? My son Daniel said with a warm smile as he wrapped his arms around me at the Christmas party. And in that moment, standing under the glow of a towering tree covered in gold ornaments and soft white lights, I felt every conversation in the room quietly fade away. I remember the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey drifting through the house, the low hum of holiday music playing somewhere near the kitchen, and the gentle clink of wine glasses from Daniel's colleagues gathered around the living room. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My son had always spoken quickly when he was excited, and tonight he certainly seemed proud, surrounded by friends, business partners, and neighbors who admired the life he had built. Daniel Hayes was known in our town as the man who had turned a small tech startup into a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars before he turned 40. People spoke about him with the same tone they used for movie stars or athletes. And yet to me he was still the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch after building toy rockets on the living room floor. I looked up at him and laughed softly, thinking perhaps it was some kind of joke meant to make the guests smile. "What money, sweetheart?" I asked, keeping my voice light so no one would feel uncomfortable during the holiday celebration. Daniel's smile faded just slightly, the way a candle flickers when a door opens in another room. For a second, he looked confused, almost embarrassed, and then he glanced past my shoulder toward his wife Victoria. That was when I noticed something small but unmistakable. Victoria had been standing beside the fireplace only a moment earlier, holding a glass of red wine and chatting with Daniel's business partner, but now she had gone very still. Her eyes met Daniel's for less than a heartbeat before she looked down at the floor. At 72 years old, I have learned that sometimes the smallest silence in a room can say more than 1,000 loud words. I cleared my throat and gave Daniel's arm a gentle squeeze, hoping to ease whatever strange misunderstanding had just appeared between us. "I think you must have me confused with someone else," I said with a quiet chuckle. "If I were receiving $5,000 a month, I certainly wouldn't still be driving that old Buick with the heater that barely works." A few people nearby laughed politely, assuming I was making a self-deprecating joke, but Daniel did not laugh. Instead, he pulled his phone from the pocket of his tailored jacket, the same jacket I had once seen in a magazine interview about young tech executives. His fingers moved quickly across the screen while the music and conversation around us carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. I noticed the way Victoria shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the way her smile had disappeared entirely now. Daniel looked up again after a moment, his brow slightly furrowed, and said quietly enough that only the three of us could hear, "Mom, I've been sending you $5,000 every month for the last 3 years." I felt the warmth of the crowded living room suddenly give way to a strange chill that had nothing to do with the winter night outside. 3 years. That meant 36 payments. I tried to calculate the number in my head, but the math refused to settle into something sensible. All I knew for certain was this. If my son believed he had been helping me all this time, then somewhere between his generosity and my quiet little house across town, something had gone terribly wrong. The rest of the Christmas party passed in a blur of laughter and polite conversations, but my mind was no longer inside that beautiful house. It felt as if I had stepped outside myself and was watching the evening from a distance, smiling at the right moments while the question Daniel had asked echoed quietly in my thoughts. $5,000 every month. The number did not make sense because my life during those same 3 years had been anything but comfortable. My little house on Maple Ridge Road was warm enough in the summer, but in winter I kept the thermostat set to 60 degrees to keep the gas bill manageable. The heater in my old Buick still rattled whenever I drove to the grocery store, and sometimes I wore my wool coat inside the car until the engine warmed up. I never complained about those small inconveniences. Daniel had worked hard for his success, and I had always believed a mother should be proud of her child's independence rather than depend on it. That belief had guided me through the quiet routines of my life. Every Tuesday morning, I walked to the local pharmacy to refill my blood pressure medication. The pharmacist, a kind young man named Eric, often asked how my son was doing in the technology world he read about in business magazines. I always smiled and said Daniel was doing very well. On Thursdays, I stopped at the small grocery store 2 blocks from my house where the cashier had begun recognizing me as the woman who always brought coupons and compared prices carefully before placing anything in her cart. I did not mind those little habits. After my husband passed away 8 years ago, I had learned to live simply. Simple meals, quiet evenings, and long walks through the neighborhood park had become the rhythm of my days. What troubled me now was not the thought that Daniel wanted to help me. In fact, the idea that my son had tried to support me warmed my heart in a way that was difficult to explain. What troubled me was the strange space between what he believed and what had actually reached my life. I thought about the past 3 winters when I carefully balanced the heating bill against my grocery budget. I remembered the afternoon last February when my doctor suggested a new prescription that my insurance did not fully cover, and I quietly decided to stay with the cheaper medication instead. At the time, it had never crossed my mind to call Daniel for help. He was busy running a company that employed hundreds of people, and I had never wanted to become one more responsibility on his already full schedule. Yet according to him, he had been helping me all along. 36 months of support that had never touched my bank account. I replayed the moment from the party again in my mind, not focusing on Daniel this time, but on Victoria. My daughter-in-law had always presented herself as organized and attentive, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, coordinated holiday dinners, and handled many of the practical details in Daniel's life. Over the years, I had come to trust that quiet efficiency. But now I remembered the exact moment when Daniel looked toward her after my answer. The brief flicker of unease on her face. The way she lowered her eyes before anyone else could notice. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with loud accusations or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it begins as a single quiet inconsistency, like a small crack forming in glass. And once you notice it, you cannot stop wondering how far that crack might spread. I left Daniel and Victoria's house later that night with the same polite smile I had worn all evening. But the moment the cold December air touched my face outside, the quiet weight of the situation settled deeper in my chest. The drive back to my house was only 20 minutes, yet it felt longer than usual because my thoughts refused to settle into anything comfortable. Christmas lights glowed along the streets of the neighborhood as families finished their celebrations inside warm homes. And for a brief moment, I remembered the years when Daniel was a boy and our own house had been filled with that same gentle holiday warmth. Back then, Christmas Eve meant baking cinnamon cookies together, wrapping presents at the kitchen table, and listening to old records while snow gathered quietly outside the windows. Those memories felt distant now, like photographs stored in a drawer you open only once in a while. When I reached my driveway, I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet car for a moment before stepping out. My house looked the same as it always did, small but tidy, with a single wreath hanging on the front door and soft yellow light glowing from the living room lamp I had left on earlier that afternoon. Inside, the silence was familiar and comforting, yet tonight it carried a different feeling beneath it. I set my coat on the chair by the door and walked slowly into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water before sitting down at the table where I usually began my mornings with coffee. Daniel's words from the party replayed again in my thoughts, but now they felt less confusing and more deliberate. My son had not spoken like someone guessing or joking. He had spoken like a man who believed he had been doing something responsible for a very long time. $5,000 every month for 3 years meant that somewhere there must be records, transfers, or statements that supported his belief. Daniel had always been careful with finances, even as a teenager. When he opened his first bank account at 16, he tracked every dollar he earned from his part-time job at the hardware store. That habit had never left him. A successful businessman does not send money for 3 years without documentation. The realization brought a quiet clarity to my thinking. If Daniel believed those payments existed, then the proof must exist somewhere as well. I stood from the table and walked into the small hallway where I kept my desk and computer. The desk was nothing special, just a wooden table I had used for years to organize bills, letters, and the occasional email to friends or family. I opened the drawer where my bank statements were stored in neat folders labeled by month and year. The stack from the past 3 years looked exactly as I remembered it, each envelope showing modest deposits from my retirement account and the small pension my late husband had left behind. There were no mysterious transfers, no unexplained deposits that could add up to the amount Daniel had described. I studied the statements carefully anyway, running my finger down each line as if the numbers might suddenly change if I looked closely enough. They did not. Everything was exactly as it had always been. After several minutes, I placed the papers back into their folder and leaned back in the chair. The room felt very still, and in that stillness a quiet decision formed in my mind. Tomorrow morning, I would go to the bank and speak directly with someone who could help me understand whether money had ever been sent in my name. I did not feel angry or frightened. Instead, I felt something calmer, something steadier. When life presents a question that does not make sense, the first step is simply to look for the truth. The next morning arrived quietly, the way winter mornings often do, with pale sunlight filtering through the kitchen curtains and a thin layer of frost covering the lawn outside my window. I woke earlier than usual, not because of worry, but because my mind had already settled on what needed to be done. After preparing a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, I gathered my coat and the folder containing my recent bank statements before leaving the house. The drive to the bank took about 15 minutes, passing the same small park and grocery store that had become part of my weekly routine. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, yet I noticed that my attention to small details felt sharper than usual, as if my mind had quietly shifted into a different way of observing the world. The bank itself was a familiar building with large glass windows and polished floors that reflected the morning light. I had visited this branch many times over the years to deposit checks from my retirement account or to ask simple questions about automatic bill payments. The young teller at the front desk recognized me and greeted me with a warm smile, asking how my holiday had been. I returned the smile politely and explained that I needed to speak with someone about my account history. Within a few minutes, I was seated across from a woman named Karen who introduced herself as one of the branch managers. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had spent many years helping people understand their finances. I explained the situation carefully, choosing my words with patience because I still did not want to assume anything before seeing the facts. I told her that my son believed he had been sending me money regularly, yet my own statements showed no such deposits. Karen listened without interrupting, occasionally typing notes into her computer before asking a few clarifying questions about my name, address, and account details. After confirming my information, she began searching through the system for any transfers connected to my name. The quiet clicking of her keyboard filled the small office while I waited. At first her expression remained neutral, but after a minute she leaned slightly closer to the screen and adjusted her glasses. I noticed that subtle change immediately. It was the kind of small shift people make when they discover something unexpected but are still deciding how to explain it. Karen printed several pages and placed them neatly on the desk between us. According to the records in front of her, there had indeed been regular transfers of $5,000 every month for the past 3 years. The payments had come from an account belonging to Daniel Hayes, exactly as he had described. For a brief moment relief passed through me because it meant my son had spoken truthfully. However, that relief lasted only until Karen pointed to another line on the document. The transfers had not gone to the account I used every day. Instead, they had been directed to a different account opened under my name at the same bank. I felt the room grow unusually quiet as she explained that the account had been established 3 years earlier with documentation that appeared completely valid. My name was listed as the primary holder, yet the contact email, phone number, and mailing address attached to the account were not mine. I studied the printed page carefully, recognizing none of the details except my own name written neatly at the top. Karen looked at me gently and asked whether I might have opened the account for a special purpose and forgotten about it. I shook my head slowly because I knew with complete certainty that I had never created any account like the one described on that paper. The moment stretched quietly between us as the meaning of that discovery settled into place. If the account existed in my name but I had never opened it, then someone else had done so. And if someone else had opened it, then that person had also been receiving every one of Daniel's monthly transfers for the last 36 months. Karen allowed the silence to remain for a moment, the way professionals sometimes do when they understand that a person needs time to absorb what they have just learned. I kept my eyes on the printed document in front of me, tracing the numbers slowly with my finger as if they might reveal something different if I looked carefully enough. $5,000 each month, beginning exactly 3 years ago, each transfer arriving with the same regular precision. The total amount printed at the bottom of the page was $180,000. I had never seen that money, never touched it, and yet the records showed clearly that someone had. Karen spoke gently when she continued explaining the details. The account had been opened with identification that matched my name and date of birth, and the paperwork included a digital signature that looked convincing enough to pass routine verification. However, the contact information connected to the account told a different story. The email address was unfamiliar to me, and the phone number did not belong to my home or my mobile phone. Even the mailing address listed for official correspondence was not my house. On Maple Ridge Road. It was an address located only 15 minutes away, in a quiet residential neighborhood I knew well, because Daniel and Victoria lived there. I felt a slow understanding forming in my mind, not dramatic or emotional, just steady and unavoidable. For several years I had trusted that Victoria managed many of the practical details in Daniel's life. She scheduled family gatherings, organized travel arrangements, and often offered to help with paperwork when it involved shared family matters. At the time it had seemed like kindness and efficiency, the kind of practical support a spouse naturally provides. But now I remembered something small from 3 years earlier, around the same time this mysterious account had been created. Victoria had visited my house one afternoon carrying a folder of documents and explaining that Daniel wanted to simplify certain financial matters for the family. She had spoken in her usual calm and organized tone, mentioning electronic records, tax forms, and the convenience of keeping information updated with the bank. I had signed a few papers without much concern because nothing in her explanation sounded unusual. I trusted my son, and by extension, I trusted the woman he had chosen to build his life with. Looking back now, that quiet afternoon suddenly felt much more important than it had seemed at the time. Karen interrupted my thoughts gently by asking whether anyone else might have had access to my personal information when the account was opened. I considered the question carefully before answering. There were only a few people who knew the details required to create something like this. My doctor had my identification on file, the Social Security office had my records, and of course Daniel and Victoria knew nearly everything about my life after years of family conversations and shared holidays. Yet only one person had ever brought paperwork into my home and asked me to sign documents connected to financial matters. I looked back down at the printed page once more, studying the unfamiliar email address and the phone number listed beneath it. Neither belonged to me, but the street name connected to the mailing address was one I recognized immediately because it was the same street where my son and his wife lived. Karen allowed me to keep the printed records while she explained that the bank could begin a formal review if I wished, but she also said something else that stayed with me during the drive home. She said that situations like this were often solved much faster when the people involved were informed calmly and given the opportunity to explain themselves. Her tone was professional, yet there was a quiet understanding in her voice, as though she had seen similar stories unfold before. I thanked her for her patience and carefully placed the documents back into my folder before leaving the branch. Outside, the winter air felt sharper than it had the day before, but my mind was clearer now. The uncertainty that had followed me home after the Christmas party had slowly transformed into something steadier. Facts have a way of doing that. Once you see them written plainly on paper, they begin arranging themselves into a picture that is difficult to ignore. When I returned to my house on Maple Ridge Road, I placed the folder on my kitchen table and sat down beside it with a cup of tea. For several minutes, I simply looked at the numbers again, letting the quiet of the room settle around me. $180,000. It was a number large enough to change many things in a person's life, yet I felt no sense of shock about the money itself. What stayed with me instead was the realization that someone had been comfortable letting me live without it. Someone had watched me keep the thermostat low in winter and drive an aging car while believing I was being supported every month. The thought was not dramatic or loud. It was calm, almost reflective, the way people sometimes feel when a long puzzle finally begins to make sense. My eyes drifted to the mailing address printed on the account documents again. The street name was familiar because I had visited that house many times for family dinners and holiday gatherings. Daniel and Victoria had lived there since shortly after their wedding, in a large brick home with tall windows and a carefully maintained garden. Victoria had always taken pride in that house. She liked everything arranged neatly, from the dining table settings to the guest rooms prepared for visitors. Over the years, she had also taken pride in managing the practical details of their life together. Bills, paperwork, travel schedules, and bank matters were often handled by her with an efficiency Daniel openly appreciated. He used to joke that without Victoria organizing things behind the scenes, he might still be forgetting to pay his electricity bill. I remembered those jokes now with a new kind of attention. It would have been very easy for someone with that level of access to organize a financial arrangement that no one questioned, especially if the person sending the money believed everything was working exactly as intended. I finished my tea slowly and closed the folder once more. The next step was not something that required anger or confrontation. What it required was patience. Daniel deserved to see the same facts I had seen that morning, and I intended to show them to him in a way that left no room for confusion. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found his name. When he answered, his voice sounded warm and relaxed, the way it always did when he spoke to me. I told him that I had visited the bank and that there was something important I wanted to discuss with him in person. He did not hesitate for a moment before suggesting that I come by the house the following afternoon. I agreed calmly and ended the call. Then I placed the folder back on the kitchen table where the afternoon sunlight rested across its surface, knowing that the quiet conversation waiting for tomorrow would change far more than just a set of numbers on a page. The following afternoon, I drove to Daniel's house with the same calm focus that had carried me through the morning at the bank. The neighborhood looked peaceful as always, lined with tall maple trees whose branches were bare against the pale winter sky. I had visited this street many times over the years, usually for birthday dinners or quiet Sunday meals, and each visit had always felt warm and familiar. Today the house looked exactly the same as it always had, the large brick exterior glowing softly in the cold sunlight, and the front porch decorated with leftover Christmas garlands that Victoria had carefully arranged earlier in the week. I parked my Buick at the curb and took a slow breath before stepping out. The folder containing the bank documents rested neatly in my handbag, its presence steady and reassuring. Daniel opened the door before I had the chance to ring the bell. He greeted me with the same easy smile he had worn at the party, the kind of smile that had made so many people trust him throughout his career. He hugged me lightly and invited me inside, asking if I wanted coffee or tea. The house smelled faintly of fresh bread and citrus cleaning spray, the quiet signs of Victoria's habit of keeping everything in perfect order. I stepped into the living room and noticed that Victoria was sitting on the sofa with a tablet in her lap. She looked up when we entered, offering a polite smile that seemed slightly tighter than usual. Daniel sat down across from me in the armchair near the window, while Victoria remained on the sofa beside the coffee table. The sunlight from outside fell across the room, creating a calm and almost ordinary atmosphere, the kind that often appears before an important truth is spoken aloud. Daniel leaned forward with a curious expression and asked what the bank had told me. I reached into my handbag and removed the folder, placing it carefully on the coffee table between us. My movements were slow and deliberate, not dramatic, simply respectful of the moment that was about to unfold. I opened the folder and slid the printed pages toward Daniel so he could read them himself. For several seconds, he studied the documents without speaking. His eyes moved steadily across the rows of numbers while the quiet ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Victoria watched him closely from the sofa, her hands folded together in her lap. Finally, Daniel looked up, his expression no longer confused but thoughtful. He confirmed that the transfers listed on the paper were exactly the payments he had scheduled 3 years earlier. He explained that he had arranged them through his financial manager after deciding that he wanted to make sure I lived comfortably without needing to ask for help. I listened quietly, grateful for his intention even as the deeper problem remained clear between us. When he finished speaking, I pointed gently to the line on the page showing the destination account. I explained that the account number did not belong to any account I had ever opened. Daniel frowned slightly and looked back down at the document, studying the information more carefully. His attention moved to the contact email and phone number listed beside the account. Details. Slowly his gaze lifted again, this time shifting toward the sofa where Victoria was sitting. The room became very still in that moment, not tense or loud, simply filled with the quiet awareness that the truth had finally reached the center of the conversation. Daniel did not speak immediately after looking toward Victoria. The silence that settled into the room felt heavier than any raised voice could have been. Victoria remained seated on the sofa with her hands folded together, but I noticed that the calm composure she usually carried had begun to slip. She looked from Daniel to the documents on the table, and then back to me, as if searching for the exact words that might restore the situation to something ordinary. Daniel leaned forward slightly and picked up the printed pages again, studying the details with the careful attention that had helped him build his company from nothing. He pointed quietly to the contact email listed beside the account number and asked a simple question. The email address was one he recognized. It was the same one Victoria used for many of the household accounts and subscriptions she managed for their home. Victoria hesitated for a moment before answering. She explained that she had handled many financial details for the family during the past few years, and that sometimes accounts were created temporarily to organize payments or investments more efficiently. Her explanation was delivered in the same composed tone she used when discussing travel plans or dinner reservations, but the words seemed to settle awkwardly in the room. Daniel listened without interrupting, yet his expression had changed from curiosity to something quieter and more serious. He asked another question, this time about the mailing address connected to the account. Victoria nodded slowly and admitted that the address belonged to their home because she had been managing several financial matters at once and believed it would be easier to organize the paperwork that way. I watched the conversation unfold without raising my voice or showing anger. The documents between us were clear enough that there was no need for emotion to explain them. Daniel lowered the papers back onto the coffee table and rested his hands together as he considered what he had just heard. For a long moment, he said nothing, but the thoughtful silence revealed more than any quick reaction could have. Finally, he looked toward Victoria again and asked the one question that had been quietly waiting since the beginning of the conversation. If the account had been created only to organize the transfers, why had the money never been redirected to my actual account once the payments began arriving each month? Victoria did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the room as if searching for a reasonable explanation, yet none seemed to appear. The quiet ticking of the wall clock became the only sound between us. I felt no desire to interrupt because the truth often arrives more clearly when people are given time to face it themselves. After several seconds, Victoria spoke again, this time more slowly. She admitted that during the first year she had intended to move the money into my account, but had delayed because she believed Daniel might want to discuss it personally with me. Then other expenses had appeared, investments had been made, and the situation had gradually become more complicated than she expected. Daniel listened to every word, his expression calm, but no longer uncertain. When she finished speaking, he looked back down at the total printed on the page, and then quietly asked a final question that filled the room with a stillness none of us could ignore. He asked whether any of the money was still there. Victoria did not answer Daniel's question right away. The silence stretched across the living room like a thin layer of ice over water, fragile but impossible to ignore. She looked down at her hands for a moment before finally speaking, and when she did, her voice sounded quieter than it had earlier. She admitted that most of the money had already been used. At first, she described it as temporary borrowing, explaining that during the past few years she had moved some of the funds into different investments, believing she could grow the amount and return it later without anyone noticing the difference. But as Daniel asked calm and direct questions, the explanation became clearer. Some of the transfers had been used to help her brother start a small business that had struggled to survive during its first year. Another portion had gone toward renovating the guest wing of their home, the same renovation I had complimented during my last visit. The rest had slowly disappeared through a series of smaller decisions that probably felt reasonable at the time, but had accumulated into something much larger than she expected. Daniel listened carefully, never raising his voice. Yet the quiet seriousness in his expression carried more weight than anger ever could. When Victoria finished explaining, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together as if organizing his thoughts the same way he organized complicated business decisions at work. I remained silent during that moment because this was not a conversation that required my judgment. The facts had already spoken clearly enough. Daniel finally looked at me with a mixture of concern and regret. He explained that when he first arranged the monthly transfers, he had imagined that the money would quietly improve my life without creating any uncomfortable conversations about support or obligation. He had trusted that the details would be handled responsibly, the same way he trusted many other responsibilities within his company and his home. I nodded gently to show that I understood his intention, because in truth the kindness behind his decision had never been in doubt. What mattered now was what would happen next. Daniel turned his attention back to Victoria and asked her one final question, not about blame, but about resolution. He asked whether she understood the seriousness of what had happened and whether she was willing to correct it. Victoria looked toward the documents on the table again before answering. She said that she would cooperate fully with whatever steps were necessary to return the money and close the account that had been created in my name. The confidence she usually carried was gone now, replaced by a quieter honesty that seemed to recognize the consequences of her choices. Daniel reached for the folder and carefully gathered the papers together again before handing them back to me. He said that he would speak with his financial advisor and the bank to ensure that the situation was corrected properly, and that every future transfer would go directly to the account I had used for years. I thanked him for taking the matter seriously, though the gratitude I felt had less to do with money and more to do with the clarity that had finally replaced uncertainty. As I stood to leave the house that afternoon, the winter sunlight still shining through the tall windows of their living room, I realized that something important had quietly shifted between all three of us. Trust, once taken for granted, had revealed how fragile it could be when handled carelessly. Yet the truth, once brought into the open, had also given us the opportunity to rebuild that trust with clearer eyes and steadier choices than before.